your summer?
One day, my darling.
What did you do?
Die Karawane.
Tell me about your winter time.
Die Karawane. Wohnwagen.
This
What will you
Die Karawane. Wohnwagen.
This is a film about
It's
caravans.
raining inside.
This is a film about caravans.
It's raining
Dies ist ein Film über Wohnwagen. Dies ist ein Film über Wohnwagen.
I've spent the entire period of this pandemic to date in the Seychelles. Sometimes I've been very busy creatively, producing a few paintings, bits of music, but at other times I've sunk into a kind of ennui. But funnily enough, this second type of time has proved to be the motivation for the first. Specifically, the lockdown period and the time after its cessation provided the opportunity of more time to consider things not directly concerned with the day-to-day demands and pressures of simply living. I think a lot of other people felt this as well, and a lot of other artists. In my case, I found myself reflecting on my early childhood and the relationship between my mother and my grandmother. My parents, the young me, and my maternal grandparents shared a small terraced house in Mitcham, southwest London. We lived modestly. We were not poor, but we were certainly not well off, with my father holding down 2 evening jobs to supplement his salary as a civil servant. He sold insurance in the evenings and at weekends. And he sold eggs, door to door. I've no idea how he did this because he didn't own a car. We couldn't afford one until much later on. And my mother also chipped in by holding Tupperware parties, which meant that she would invite her friends and neighbours round to the house and they would consume cheese and pineapple chunks speared onto cocktail sticks and peruse and hopefully order and buy Tupperware products, which were kind of plastic utensils and containers that were meant to be airtight and keep your food fresh for longer. In fact, what they did was make your food smell of plastic. My parents had already seen the first 2 of their children die in infancy, Peter and Paul. So when I was born and survived, I was, despite our meagre household income, rather indulged. My mother worked, and when she was at work, my grandmother would look after me, and my mum would return just in time to make tea. There was no concept of dinner as an evening meal in my family. Dinner was served midday, and the big dinner of the week was Sunday dinner. If for any reason I didn't like the food placed in front of me, my grandmother would come downstairs. She and her husband lived upstairs. And she'd say, "You come upstairs with Nanny, my pet, and Nanny will give you something nicer to eat than this." I was, of course, unaware of how hurtful this was to my mother, or how tension and rivalry for my young affections was brewing. And so, aged 3, of course, I would toddle upstairs and tuck in. At that time, my grandmother would also get out this thick wallet from her cupboard, full of £1 notes. They no longer exist, of course. £1 will barely buy you a chocolate bar these days. But then, it was a considerable amount of money. And she would fan through this wad of notes and she'd say to me, "One day, my darling, all this will be yours." That never happened. She died when I was 8 years old, and the money was discovered by her husband, William, who, as a bus driver, didn't earn much. So he was only too happy to take the wad of money and convert it into beer at the local pub. Despite not having much money as a family, we did take a holiday every year without fail. We would stay mostly in a caravan, a kind of mobile home which was always immobile, parked and raised on piles of bricks in the middle of an open field, which constantly collected strong gusts of wind. I recall many rainy days and very few sunny ones. We would rent our caravan, but other people, richer people, would own their caravan, and they would bring it with them on the back of their car, something I thought to be really fantastic. Sometimes we would take with us a neighbour's daughter. Her name was Linda, and I fell in love with her at the age of 4. But she was 8, and clearly unobtainable. We stayed in a different caravan every summer. The thing about caravans is that so much inside of them is hinged, so that tables and sofas can quickly become beds. Space is obviously at a premium, so that it facilitates daytime activity and is then recalibrated and reinvented once the day ends. The interior of a caravan is therefore bipolar in nature, or at least schizophrenic. It doesn't really know what it is some of the time. These are conditions more commonly applied to human beings rather than a funny little box on wheels, which could be dragged behind the family car, dumped in a field somewhere for a few pounds, and then lived in for a week. But the caravans all had personalities. Far more than a house, it seemed to me. In our street, all the houses looked the same design, the same colour, the same front doors. But with caravans, they were all different. Different colours, different designs, different formulations of windows and doors, different bits hanging off. Some had television areas. Each had its idiosyncrasies. Invariably, things didn't work as they should, but as long as the toilet and the shower worked, my dad tended to overlook this. Looking back, I can see that caravan holidays were really a necessity. We couldn't afford anything grander. A hotel was out of the question, even a guest house. But for me, they were extremely romantic holiday venues, with or without Linda. Now, of course, I recognise that it must have been very difficult for my parents to indulge in a more adult kind of romance, especially if, as sometimes happened, my grandparents were also on board. Recently, I've been making paintings which include caravans alongside images of me as a child and my youngish parents and older grandparents. In one of the paintings, there are pencil drawings of my mother, she must have been in her mid-30s at the time, and her mother, my grandmother, and they are head to toe, symbolic of the fact that although they were very, very closely related, they were, from time to time, in deep and desperate opposition and rivalry over the affections of this funny little boy with sticky out ears. Before making these paintings, I took photographs of old abandoned caravans in the English countryside, and believe me, there are many. I've also been purchasing old toy caravans, die-cast and tin plate, which are faithful reproductions of the real thing and, being battered by decades of play, often resemble the actual caravans which my family tended to end up in. Only now do I understand that the caravan represents, for me, something of the love-hate, well, perhaps hate is too strong a word here, but anyway, the love-hate relationship shared by my mother and my grandmother, Kathleen, my mother, and Gladys, my grandmother. One born from the other, and ending up in the mid-1950s at war over the affections of a toddler. A toddler who became increasingly confused about who to love, who to go to, how not to, he quickly learned, show too much affection to one in the company of the other, lest that cause pain and hurt. So at a very early age, I learned to control, manipulate, and ration my emotions and my emotional life. The changing nature of the inside space of the caravan has come to represent the way in which my day as a small child could change as my mother returned from work and, technically at least, my grandmother's responsibility as my carer came to an end. A table becomes a bed. A grandmother becomes a mother. The other thing about vintage caravans is their beauty, their design and the materials from which they were fabricated, their aerodynamic line to make the pulling easier, the fusion of metal, soft furnishings and wood, the ingenuity of making very small spaces functional. In this sense, they complement the concepts behind some very small Japanese interiors, which would have been an ironic revelation at the time, in view of the fact that my father, throughout the first 12 years of my life, was recovering psychologically and physically from being tortured in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And he had an understandably pathological hatred of all things Japanese. You know, my father had these odd rituals, even on a caravan site, surrounded by mud and grass and rubbish sometimes. He would wear a suit, or at least a nice pair of trousers, braces, maybe even a tie. And he'd do this to go and collect the milk or the newspapers. And sometimes I'd go with him and we'd meet some other guy, also doing the same thing, also surprisingly smartly dressed. No shorts, that would have been completely unthinkable. You had to dress properly. And it was the same for people in the other fields who were staying in tents. They also dressed well. The men, the women, the children as well. Almost as if they were going straight from the caravan site to church. And I guess they were happy times, although it's really hard to say, isn't it, when we look back. In the moment, was it happy? I don't know. I can't really remember. But that's the thing about metaphors for happiness. They kind of all get muddled up, don't they? And we remember the good things. And with the caravans, I remember the feeling at night of people turning over in the caravan, this thing rocking on its wheels, on its axis, with maybe some rain and wind lashing outside. And then, you know, you kind of go back to dreams, and you were somewhere else. And then the next day, you might do some crabbing, you go on the beach, you'd run around if it was nice weather, go to the amusement arcades. Life was good, and it was exciting, and it was wonderful. But then, you know, there's a danger now that the paintings, the buying the little toys, which I guess is a bit like, you know, trying to kind of find again the railway, the model railway set you had when you were 9 years old, and setting it up again as a late middle-aged man. Something a bit sad about that, I guess. A bit pathetic, but also something quite charming, quite nice. So the caravans stand as symbols of something far beyond what they ever contained. Symbols of family, of togetherness, of being forgetful of worries. And I'm sure my parents had loads of those, but for a week every year, they'd leave them behind. And they'd just be. They would just be. We would all just be. We would just be. would all just be. We would just be.